over 20 years ago. We had a victim of a violent sexual assault walk into headquarters to report she was assaulted. She was smiling and said, "I was just sexually assaulted." Our dispatcher looked at her and said, "You were sexually assaulted?" I'm glad to say this was over 20 years ago, but I will tell you, as a young police officer at the time, it had a lot of impact on me and really pushed me to make sure I did it right so no one else would ever suffer like that. Very simply, there's medical definitions of what trauma is, emotionally what a person goes through, but the simplest way to describe trauma for me is people will act differently really to survive.
Because they're hurting and they don't know how to deal with it.
I think you need to look at trauma in a student in any way that seems to really vary from their normal patterns.
I do think that most people have some preconceived ideas about what are typical behaviors of a victim, and you see that all the time, and you see that in not just a campus community but just in the world at large. Every individual is different, and so there is no one way to be a victim. There is no typical way to present after you've been assaulted. So you have to keep a very open mind, and you cannot go into these investigations or into these situations with preconceived ideas about what you should be expecting or how you should be behaving.
Over years, you start understanding more and more about what it looks like when someone's been traumatized and how that plays out in their recollection, in their response. You know, some people may not be crying, some people may be crying. Some are very quiet. So you have to be able to understand those dynamics.
Something that is traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you, and something that's traumatic to you, down the line. And I think for me, I don't ever want a student specifically to feel like they have to fit into a box of trauma, because I don't know what trauma looks like for them.
There is a neurobiology to trauma, so everybody reacts differently because of the way that their brain is processing the information. So it's important to think about that in terms of everybody acts differently when they smell coffee. Some people hate it, some people love it, and that's a really simplistic way to look at it. It's quite complicated, but the thing that you need to understand when you're responding is that the way that person is acting is because of how whatever happened to them affected them. Compare it to going down a drop on a roller coaster. I mean, some of us could sweat, some of us might scream, some of us might laugh and feel exhilarated, some of us may cry. It can really affect anyone in a different way.
But in those situations where you're dealing with a victim, your response can shut that person down. It can make them not want to share their story, and it prevents them from getting the help they need. Whether it's on the phone or in person, if they're not able to communicate to a person that level of care and concern, almost regardless of what it's about, it sets the tone for everything else. And when you're trying to deal with people who've been harmed, you really have to think carefully and hard about what your presence and how you're going to project that out.
And a lot of times the victim sometimes feels like they're being, probed and used as a piece of evidence, so to speak, for the case and for the investigation and so forth.
How did the police officer respond? Were they empathetic? Were they believing? Did they offer you the services that you required? Were they judgmental? These can set off different triggers of trauma and re-victimize the person.
Think about kindness. Think about how they might feel, what their fear level is. You want to get to the bottom line, you want to get to the law, you want to get to a perpetrator. But first you need to treat the person, and you need to treat the person as a person, not as a victim. You need to treat them as someone who deserves respect, who needs your kindness and your support, and they need dignity.
Just simply to help the victim, especially during the initial interview, is just ask what they need. Ask what they want to say and ask what you can do for them.
think you have to take it at face value that here's another human being across from you who's sharing something that horribly that happened to them, and being able to remember that we're all in this together and trying to be there to get them to the resources and connect them to the right people. It's let them tell their story in the way they can, but also knowing that your role as an officer or a public safety person is to help move them to the right place, to the right people to help.